Morning, everyone, and welcome to episode 78 of the Retrospectives podcast, Celeste. My name is Patrick Arthur, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, James Turlings. James, we're doing something a little different today, something that we've never really done before, or, have done kind of once before.
We did it once with Dark Souls, right?
Yes, that was episode 50. That was our cheat episode where we decided to move the timeline up a bit. But this episode, we're going far newer. We're going to within 3 years, within 2 years, 2.5 years, and we're covering the 2018 modern-day classic, Celeste. James, are you excited to do Celeste today?
I'm kind of nervous, actually. Like, this game is, it's kind of special to me, right? And I feel like I just want to do this episode well, right?
Yeah, me too. So every year we have two kind of special Christmas episodes, and we decided, for one of our special Christmas episodes, we would cover a game that James and I were both very high on. It's going to be a bit different from our normal stuff, because normally what we do, for those who haven't listened, is we play old classic games and we evaluate whether they've stood the test of time or not. This is a bit different. I think straight out the gates, I just want to say James and I are very high on Celeste. We both like it a lot. We've both played it to completion, or at least the main game to completion before. And this was us coming back and playing through it again, mainly so that we could tell you what we like about it. That doesn't mean it's flawless, of course, and there's going to be lots of good discussion, I'm sure. But this is more of an in-depth analysis and discussion about what Celeste is and how it works and what we like about it than it is necessarily trying to criticize it and see if it's stood the test of time for what we normally do. So, for those who've never heard of Celeste before, it's a 2D platformer first released in 2018 by Extremely OK Games. So the game was directed, designed, and written by a single person called Maddie Thorson. Although it wasn't strictly a one-person show, she got people in to do other music, and Noel Berry is the other big programmer. It's a fully realized version of a Pico 8 version of the game. Pico 8 is like it's a game developing tool, kind of like Unity or something like that. And it was the original version of the game was like made over 4 days as part of a game jam. And Celeste is kind of the 2018 game is the fully realized version of that game. In the game, you take control of a character called Madeline as she attempts to climb a mountain, and she confronts her fears and anxieties made manifest along the way. So that's the absolute basic setup of the game. I think that where we should start with our discussion is probably the story, James. Just because although Celeste is a deeply mechanical experience, it also has a... I think the story is quite important to the overall experience.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
So the story, I would say, is quite simple. It's mainly told in cutscenes in between the levels where you do your platforming. But I think it's a very effective one. The idea is that Madeline wants to climb this mountain, Celeste. She herself doesn't even know why she really wants to do it. She wants to prove something to herself. She wants to show she can do it. Madeline struggles with both depression and anxiety. And the thing that's special about this mountain she's climbing is that the mountain kind of reflects those fears and anxieties and brings them to life. So a lot of the things that Madeline is facing are manifestations of her innermost fears and anxieties. It's very metaphorical, and I don't think a lot of what's happening is meant to be taken literally, even though as a platformer and the platforming challenges you face are literally things you have to deal with. But it's basically tackling mental health in a lot of ways. Did you find that Madeline's journey to try and overcome the mountain and the things on it resonated with you, James?
Yeah, it did quite a bit. Like, I personally have also struggled with these things myself in the past. And, I found it very relatable throughout most of the journey. It's not a particularly, subtle take on the issues, I think. Like, a lot of the imagery and the kind of things that are happening are very, in your face. But I think that kind of works in the context of a game which kind of prides itself on everything being very to the point, very short and snappy. So having the story be very direct in its approach, I think kind of works to its strengths in that way. Structurally, I don't think it's, perfect. I think that somewhere in the middle it kind of meanders a bit and isn't particularly honing in on a specific point. But I think that I guess the climax of the experience and like overcoming your other self and kind of this reconciliation that the character has with herself and moving forward as a stronger person hits, a home run. I think the latter half of the game's story beats are like basically perfect with, the middle kind of being okay.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. So the game split up into 7 chapters, and I'd say chapters 3 and 4 don't really have too much in the way of Madeline struggling with her inner demons. They're just kind of like fun story asides or just platforming challenges. And then when we hit chapter 5, we kind of get back into the heart of what I think makes the story special. I also think that there's something to be said for the rhythm of the gameplay kind of reflecting what Madeline is going through. Like, Celeste is a very challenging game, and you die a lot in it. And you try to, as you're playing the game, you're trying to overcome its challenges. And I think that that's reflected in the way Madeline is trying to come to terms with her fear and anxiety and, her own personal challenges.
Yeah, like the main imagery of the game, right, is the idea of climbing that mountain, of getting to the top, of overcoming hardship. And that is, reflective of the gameplay because Celeste, like as you said, is very hard. And basically, anytime you get to a new platforming challenge, it's like staring at a mountain, like, how am I ever going, to overcome this? And then, after quite a while of slow progress, you eventually get there. And I think that's like a theme that's reflected again and again and again, like hundreds of times throughout your journey with this game. I think that they have done a really good job at marrying the themes of the story with your experience as a player actually playing the game because, this game is hard it's hard on purpose, right? Like I think a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the game's themes would fail to shine through if this game was a cakewalk. Like it would not ring true with the story unless the player had to, overcome seemingly unbeatable odds like all the time.
The other part of the story that I really liked was the arc she goes through with her alter ego, which I don't know if it's her official name, but everyone calls her Madeline because she's the bad version of Madeline. Very, very subtle, I know. But the interesting part about that arc is that it's like I guess, it seems like the evil side of her, but in the end, it's less about rejecting that part of herself and more about understanding that part of herself and coming to terms with that part of herself. Because like you, James, I've also struggled a lot with these kinds of mental health issues, and I think that you can't just push away something that's fundamentally part of you, but if you try to understand it, you can go a long way to coming to terms and be more comfortable with yourself as a person. And I quite liked that development, that it was more about understanding Madeline than it was defeating her.
Obviously, we're going, this is going to be full of spoilers.
We
But
say
like
after we spoil
we say after we
it.
spoil everything. I'm sorry, guys, but it's kind of hard not to talk about it because the story's pretty, I'd say, succinct. So it's kind of hard to talk about it without going into specifics. But I think a big revelation later on, as you alluded to, is this idea that this other part of her isn't evil, right? Like when I played through the game again for this show, it was very clear to me that she was framed as being evil because of the main character's perceptions of her. Like whenever she talks at the beginning of the game, it's always out of like concern. It's like, I'm worried about you. You shouldn't do this. It's dangerous, right? Like
Mhm.
she's not actively saying things like, I hate you. I want you to die and fall off the mountain, right? It's all anxiety and concerns and like it's what the main character feels is holding her back in life. These fears of, doing things that are risky or dangerous, like this anxiety. It's very clear to me that, the character design comes across as being super obviously super evil, right?
There's a great bit where the characters, when they speak, they appear in frames in the top left, like a little picture of their portrait. At one point, she's literally bursting out of the portrait to
She does
show.
that like all the time. She
Yeah,
just like bursts out of it. It's great. I find it really entertaining. And it kind of like it makes the conversations really dynamic when this stuff happens. Like they're not afraid to do things that are unexpected, and I think that's true for the whole game. But yeah, like I think a really important part of it is like trying to recognize that you can't just cut a part of yourself out. You have to like learn to deal with it. And I think one of the things that really rings true for me in the story is that a lot of the story is kind of accumulating with you getting to the top of the mountain, but that's not the end, right? Like, that's not how life works. Like, you don't get to the top of this difficult thing and then suddenly the rest of your life is like easy mode. It's like there's going to be another mountain in your life. And the game kind of, I think, does a good job of showing that by having like a large portion of the game's gameplay take place after the story. I guess to me, that's like one of the most important things. It's less about trying to like solve specific issues and just like learning to like pick yourself up after failure after failure after failure, right?
yeah, and this is all to say, like, the story of Celeste is still fairly simple. Like, I wouldn't say
Yeah.
this is the best. It's not like anywhere near, say, pathologic tier in terms of storytelling,
Yeah.
but it's a very well told story, and it has a warmth to it. I think, particularly as you come towards the end, it's very hard in chapter 7 not to be completely swept up in the feeling of excitement and elation as you finally start rapidly ascending the mountain. So for me, I really like the story. Sometimes you don't need a super complicated story for it to be effective, and I think this is a very effectively told story.
Yeah, simple but enjoyable. It's not, the greatest thing ever told, but I do quite enjoy it.
So the other thing I wanted to bring up with the storytelling is something that I was completely unaware of until I was doing some more reading about Celeste in preparation for the show, and that's that Madeline, the character, is canonically transgender. So developer Maddie Thorson, she wrote an article confirming that Madeline was transgender, I think a little bit after the free DLC Chapter 9 was released. And I'll pop a link to that in the show notes. It's a really good article, and it goes over Maddie's gender identity journey and how that was kind of reflected in the game over time. So the point I want to raise here, which is one that Maddie herself raises in the article, is that the fact that Madeline's journey is that of a transgender person, and the fact that a lot of the struggles that she goes through are specific to a transgender person doesn't mean that the way that James and I and many other people relate to it is any less valid or any less insignificant. And in fact, in many ways, it's more significant because it speaks of the universality of mental health problems and the struggle that many of us face against it. Because I think there was a lot of backlash for some reason when it was confirmed that Madeline was transgender, and it just shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what it all means. The fact that it's more meaningful to a transgender person doesn't mean that CIS people can't take a lot away from it. It just means that it's opened up another perspective for us to experience and enjoy.
Yeah, to me, it's interesting because in the article she says that while writing the game, she herself didn't know these things about either herself or Madeline as a character, but like just as the story was being written, these things kind of subconsciously found their way into the story that now, on reflection, on her own part, it seems painfully obvious to her and many players of the game that this was the case all along, right? To me, that's really interesting because it kind of highlights a point in someone's life that's like full of confusion and anxiety, right? Like, I think a lot of works that try to tackle this difficult subject often kind of accumulate with this point of, this point of revelation at the end where they're like, I now fully understand who I am and I'm happy about that, right? Well, this doesn't do that. To me, that's a bit more interesting because it shows people at a point in their life where they probably are the most confused. Like, I feel like the people at that point in their life kind of most need this game, right? Like, it's hard and difficult.
I really think that's a fantastic point. Like, you're right. And this is something that's reinforced in Celeste over and over again, particularly when we get to chapter 9. Like, there's no point of snap your fingers, I know who I am now. Like, that's
I
just
have
not
all the
how it
answers.
works.
No,
Yeah.
it's like people are fucking complicated and confusing.
Yeah, and you do it step by step, and that doesn't mean that you're not progressing. It just means that it's like you said, it's just complicated. And I think that the confusion and the things that Madeline face demonstrate that you don't reach a point where it's all happiness and sunshine and rainbows.
Immediately, right? Like it's a long gradual process, and
Hmm.
like to me, I guess I haven't gone through this issue myself, but it seems to me like, the hardest part is like starting to climb that mountain of understanding yourself, not getting to the end, I guess.
There is no getting to the end, I don't think.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's just the B-sides and the C-sides.
Yeah, so I think that so normally James and I do retro video games, right? We do games that are 15 plus years old, and I think that what we like doing is we like saying, well, old games do this better, but new games do this better. I think it's indisputable that what modern games do better, particularly in the indie space, is the issue of representation. If you look 20, 25 years ago, the vast majority of video games are from a fairly CIS point of view. But in today's world, particularly in the indie space, we have a wide range of views represented. And I want to highlight Celeste as being an example of a game that exposed me to a perspective that I wouldn't otherwise really have been actively exposed to. And I appreciate it for that reason. And I appreciate indie gaming as a whole for that reason.
Yeah, I do like when I play something and learn something unexpected. I think video games are better when they're more varied.
Yeah, so that's about all we have for story. James, I honestly think it's a little early, but I think this might be a good time for a music break.
So when I first played Celeste, I was extremely high on the soundtrack. And when I played Celeste, that was before we started this show. This was years ago now, right? So, or it would have been like maybe right at the start or very close to around the time where we started the show. And since then, we've played over 70 games on the show, and I've been exposed to many brilliant soundtracks and some very mediocre ones. So since then, I think I've actually come down a bit on the soundtrack overall. Like, I'd say it's very firmly in the realm of great, like very good. And there are some like genuine, like 10 out of 10 songs on the soundtrack. I think that there are some just okay ones as well too, which I noticed a lot more in my second playthrough though. Whereas I felt like in my first playthrough, I got really attached to like 4 specific songs and just thought about them specifically when I played this game. But overall, I still think the soundtrack's great. It does a good job of having the music reflect what's happening on screen with regards to the story and the gameplay and the mechanics. So overall, I'm quite high on it.
See, I was high when I listened to it the first time, and I'm still extremely high. In fact, if anything, I'm higher than I was when I first listened to it. I think that it's not just that the music in the abstract is enjoyable. I think that the way the music is used as you play through the game is simply phenomenal. So most levels in this game, they're divided into those 7 chapters. They kind of have 2 to 3 distinct phases, and the music changes as you go from phase to phase to reflect the new challenge that you're facing, which is amazing. You see an evolution of the music as you progress through the chapters. In addition to that, the B-sides, which are more difficult remixes of the main game, of the main chapters, have completely new music to reflect the fact that you're in a new version of the game.
Well,
You know,
it's not completely new music; it's remixed music to go along. Yeah,
the B side of the cassette tape.
yeah, exactly, which is great in its own way. I'd say that my main criticism of the music, if I have any, is that it doesn't entirely play to the game's strengths once the story has ended. Like, I reckon, like, as you said, like, if you listen to the soundtrack, when you listen to a single song, you'll notice that the song is kind of split into, like,
3 parts?
chunks. Yeah, because it's like 3 parts, because it's a soundtrack, and different parts of that one song play during different bits of the level. So, like, if you kind of consider each, like, little chunk as its own song, they're only, like, like a minute long, a minute and a half long, right? So, once you beat the story, I would say, I honestly, to me, because I finished the Seasides like the first time I played the game, and now I'm almost at the end of chapter 9, I spent, like probably like 6 hours on the story the first time around. This time it was like 3. I got through it quite fast. But my save file at the end of my first playthrough was like 60 hours, and I spent like 54 hours in the post like story content, and the post story content is significantly more challenging than the story. Like, it's really hard. Like, in some levels I will have over 1,000 deaths. Like, it's insanely difficult. And because of that, you'll often spend like, like 600 plus deaths on one room with the same song playing. So for me, once you get to the difficult parts of the game, the soundtrack, like the individual bits on the song being like a minute and a half, is just way too short when you're playing these levels for like an hour straight, I guess.
I think that's a fair criticism, because definitely as I was getting, if I was stuck somewhere, like I would be listening to the music pretty happily, but if I got stuck somewhere, I'd reach a point where I was like, all right,
turn it off, right?
time to take off my headphones for a bit, because I've been listening to the same track on repeat about 10 times.
Forever. Yeah.
So that is true, that when you start getting to the extremely challenging parts of this game and you're stuck listening to it over and over, it's not so good that you can listen to the same track for 2 hours straight.
Yeah, in some games where it's like there's like a couple rooms where this will happen, that's kind of forgivable. But here, I feel like that's the expected way to play the game, is just to die a million times. So I think it's like a significant problem, like on repeat playthroughs, and even on your first time through the difficult content. So.
Yeah, the songs aren't 12-minute epics. They're 3 to 4 minutes long.
So I would say that there's a bunch of songs on the soundtrack that are just like brilliant. Like all of the music that plays during the climactic scenes is exceptional. Like during the battle and boss fight, spoilers, the music is fantastic. And during the final ascent of the mountain, it's just like the most inspiring shit I've ever heard. Right?
Well,
like, it's incredible.
The particularly cool thing about that final one is that in that chapter, you're ascending the mountain and you're going through all of the areas you went through earlier in the level. And as you reach each one, you kind of hear a reprise of that theme, of the initial theme. So it's kind of like the entire soundtrack, somehow fit into one song.
Yeah, I'd also give specific mention to 3 of the B-side tracks, specifically the resort level, the Mirror Temple, and Reflection, which I think will do a really good job of sounding completely unlike any of the other music in the game, while still fitting and being really enjoyable.
So James, which one do you want to do for our music break?
Yeah, so if I'm going to choose one, I'll have to choose my favorite piece of music on the soundtrack, which is the Resort's B-side theme. I just think it's, it's wonderful. I love it. With the only time, I would stop listening to it was maybe on the Seaside for that level after a few hundred deaths. So we're gonna go for our music break. Resort B-side. Here it is, guys. Hope you enjoy it. Patrick, I love that song. It's fantastic. If every other song I loved as much as that one, I think it would be an easy 10 out of 10 soundtrack.
Yeah, I mean, I like it as well. Not as much as you do. There are other songs I like more, but it's difficult for me to criticize any of these pieces of music too harshly.
Yeah. Okay, so let's start talking about the gameplay, and we can pick one of Patrick's songs later. I guess we'll go with a brief overview of the level structure, and then after we kind of briefly explain how the levels play out and what controls, I want to hone in specifically on how Celeste's, I guess, level progression and structure is different from traditional platformers, and why I think it's vastly superior.
Yeah, so this is an interesting thing. Like, we've covered 2D platformers on the show before. We've done Earthworm Jim, Super Mario World, Sonic. But Celeste is a modern 2D platformer, and it's very different from all those other games. So,
Yeah.
from a big picture level design structure, the key difference is that instead of having a level that you need to get from start to finish of with like a couple of checkpoints in between, Celeste has its 7 chapters, and those chapters are divided into screens, probably about, just estimating here, 40 to 50 screens apiece. So a screen is simply, as it suggests, it's a big room, and the room is on your screen. Often it'll just all fit on your screen at once, but the larger screens will scroll from one end to the other. And at the beginning of every screen, there's a checkpoint. So to move through a chapter in Celeste, there are 40 to 50 screens, and that also means there are 40 to 50 checkpoints. So immediately, this is quite different from, say, Mario, which is, each level will have
one continuous screen that scrolls the whole way through, right? Like, I reckon the majority of this game's individual challenges just fit on one screen, and the camera never moves the whole screen.
Yeah, although that does start to change as you move towards the more difficult content. Those screens start getting a little bit larger to reflect the, I guess, higher momentum and more the fact that you're kind of moving around the screen more. But the key is it's not a big level. It's just like a reasonable size screen.
It's like a long series of single rooms that have self-contained puzzles and platforming challenges. Yeah, there's like a couple things in the entire game that require you to do things across screens, but for like 99% of the content, like, you only need what's on the screen in order to progress.
And it probably takes 10 to 20 seconds to clear a screen once you know how to do it. And if you're a speedrunner, far less. But for us mortal human beings, literally only once you know how to do it and on your successful attempt, most screens will take 10 to 20 seconds. And then you have a new checkpoint. It's a very different design philosophy from older platformers, and it's much more in line with Super Meat Boy for those who have played that. And even though Super Meat Boy was divided into levels and each screen was considered a level, it's effectively the same. The main difference in Celeste is that you generally start in the bottom left-hand side of a level and you're trying to get to the top right-hand side of the level because you're, climbing a mountain, and that's the direction you're climbing. So as you proceed through a chapter, you are moving from screen to screen in an upwards progression, even as each and every screen is self-contained.
Yeah, and honestly, out of everything that we're going to talk about on the episode, to me, this structure is the most important part of what makes the game enjoyable to me. I would say the effect that this has on me as a player is that, often Celeste's levels are very difficult, right? You will die within like 2 seconds of starting the room. But like when you die, there's like a 2.5 second respawn time, and then you're immediately attempting the room again. Like, there's basically no downtime between, death and you trying again. Whereas I think if you play something like Sonic or Mario, you dying can put you back to the start of the level potentially, which makes, you take another like 5-10 minutes to get back up to where you were trying to beat the room. In Celeste, you just get to, once you've beaten a room, the game doesn't require you to ever beat it again to finish the level. You just get to always interact with the content that's currently challenging and engaging for you. And I'm content. Like, if I'm playing the hard levels and I die like 1,000 times on one room, it's way less frustrating to me than, in these other games where I have to walk all the way back to the bit that I'm actually trying to beat.
The key here is that so the baseline difficulty of Celeste is much higher than a Mario or a Sonic. Like what you're expected to do to get through a screen successfully is even as soon as like level 2 or 3 is generally way higher than in Mario. In fact, you could say that it's like you're up to like end game Mario challenges like a castle by the time you hit level 2. The difference is it's way less punishing. If you die in Mario, you go back to the start. In Celeste, you go back 5 seconds. So the game is able to push the lever on difficulty because it's so unpunishing. And as James said, the structure of the game informs this decision as well to make the game as difficult as it is, even on the chapter A levels.
Yeah, and like something really good about the singular room focus is something you brought up when we did Sonic the Hedgehog, was that often we felt like we couldn't see everything on screen until it was like so close to us that it killed us or slowed us down. Celeste is very zoomed out compared to, Sonic or Mario or something else. So basically all the information you need for the most part is like given to you on the screen. And when the rooms are bigger than just your normal viewport, there's often a set of like binoculars on the ground that you can use to look around the level before you start to attempt it. So yeah, structurally, I really like it. The game is just engaging and like addictive, even because when you die, you get this feeling of, damn, I almost had it. And because it respawns you while you're in the grips of that, like, it's like a good kind of frustration. It like compels you to try again and again and again, rather than, you getting discouraged and it wasting your time.
I would go one step further and I would say that death is almost how you learn what to do and how to understand the mechanics of the game. Like, I would say most platformers discourage experimentation because of how punishing it can be to die. Like, they'll often tempt you by saying, oh, here's an extra life over here, or, here's some bonus coins or whatever it is. But you won't want to do it because if you die, you have to go all the way back to the start of the level. So let's says, oh, here's a strawberry, and you actively chase after that strawberry, a free bonus, because there's no ramifications for death. It's about experimenting with your moveset and seeing what you can do, seeing what sticks until you figure out what works.
I think a trap a game like this or a game like Super Meat Boy can fall into, where lots of the levels are often just like walls of spikes and you need to make lots of really precise jumps, is that you can often, the fear is that you make levels that require exact solutions and that punish experimentation. I think for the most part, the screens in Celeste have like more than one solution, especially near the start of the game. And even like when I'm going through chapter 9 and I'm struggling on a room and I look up what someone else has done, I find that my solution is different to someone else's, even in chapter 9, which is like insanely difficult. I think they've done a good job with that in this game, and being able to try all these different ways of beating a room without fear, like you said, is because it's so like there's no punishment, there's no shitty live system, which I've gone on record as saying I hate in basically all games. There's nothing like that. You just get to constantly play the bits that are engaging.
Yeah, you go, let's see if this works. It's like, will my jump plus dash cover this gap? I don't know. Let's see if it works. Do I have enough stamina to climb up this wall and jump to that platform? I don't fucking know. Let's see what happens. And that's what you do in Celeste. You try stuff until you find a strategy that works, and then you try to execute it. And I think that incorporating experimentation into a platformer is brilliant. And it does it in a way that never feels frustrating or unfair. Well, occasionally frustrating, but I would
Pretty
say
often frustrating,
but never unfair. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like frustrating in the right kind of way, right? Like
Yes.
there's some games are frustrating in a really awful way. This game, I feel like almost every single time I die, I know it's my fault. Um, it puts the frustration in your hands, and you have to like learn to deal with that and learn to develop a process for learning the rooms and overcoming them. Yeah, it's very cool. It really shows how people learn through experimentation, I think. Better than a lot of other games.
Let's explain a little bit how the absolute basic mechanics of Celeste work. I think it will better illustrate our point if people understand how it is you control Madeline. So, Madeline's basic mechanics as you control her character are actually very simple. To start with, there's no run button. You move at a constant speed all the time, which is actually fairly slow. You're not going anywhere near as fast as a normal run. It's probably slightly faster than a Super Meat Boy walk or a Super Mario walk. You have a jump, and that jump is not a very large jump relative to the levels you're in. It's quite a small jump. Once again, much smaller than Mario, Sonic, Super Meat Boy, etc. Madeline has two, I guess, special moves apart from walking around and jumping. She has a climb and a dash. So the way her climb works is if you're on a wall, you can hold down a button to grip to it, and you can climb up and down that wall and jump off it. And you have a stamina bar, not a visible one, but there's a stamina bar that restricts how long you can climb. It works pretty much the same as in Zelda Breath of the Wild. If your stamina runs out, you'll start flashing red and you'll start sliding down the side of the slope. So you have the ability to climb up the sides of most platforms until your stamina runs out. And finally, and most importantly, the thing that defines Madeline and Celeste as a platformer is the dash. So Madeline has a 8-directional dash. You can go any of the cardinal directions plus diagonal directions, which gives her a burst of speed that she can use in midair. Importantly, once you've used your dash, your hair turns from red to blue, and you can no longer dash again until you either land on the ground, you dash over a special crystal that you move over a crystal which refills your dash and resets your stamina for more climbing, or you interact with one of the many objects in the world that resets your dash. So
I can't believe Celeste stole the crystal from Doom Eternal.
Yes, yeah. Doom Eternal, the original platformer that games such as Celeste ripped off. Yeah, so as James said, Doom Eternal ripped off Celeste badly in this department. But the idea is that Madeline has a bunch of ways to reset her dash without landing on the ground, and the level design is built in this way. There's a bunch of objects in the world. There are bubbles, there are bumpers you can collide with, there are star blocks that you can dash through to get a bunch of momentum, and every time you move through or interact with these objects, you also get your dash meter and your stamina climb meter reset. So what this all adds up to is that Madeline at a baseline has a very simple moveset. She can run, jump, climb, and dash. However, the way the level design works and the way the level design escalates is that limited moveset is pushed to its absolute limit in increasingly complicated and eventually ludicrous ways, to the point where you get levels where you will be platforming for a minute and a half without ever touching the ground, and you'll have dashed 20 times in that time period. So even though the basics of how to control Madeline are extremely simple, the game objects in the world create quite a complicated set of variables for you to interact and try and solve these levels.
Simple but deep is a great way to describe the game. All of the mechanics and all of the little building blocks that make up the levels, I feel when they added them to the game, they spent a long time trying to find ones that had a lot of depth to them, a lot of ways that can be used in a dozen different ways. My favorite little mechanic or like obstacle, I guess, in the game is one of the probably like the first one they introduce, which is these little blocks with a traffic light on them. And basically, when you land on the block very rapidly accelerates along its track and then comes to a complete stop at the end of the track and then like slowly ticks back to its start position. And at the beginning, this is very simple. It's just a moving platform, effectively. And then as you do the level, you discover that if you jump during the acceleration, you will retain momentum and gain a heap of distance on your jump. You can do this while grabbing onto the side of them. You know, they can have things like springs and spikes on top of them. And this mechanic is used all the way, you know, through the difficult levels as well, even in chapter 9, and just constantly there's more and more design space that is shown to the player with this just very simple mechanic. And I'd say that's true for, you know, the vast majority of the obstacles in this game. They're very, very simple at a basic level, and then they are just, you know, pushed upwards and upwards forever, and it feels like, you know, there's no end to what can be done with these like interesting little obstacles.
I would say one of the most, to give an example of how that can be a deeper mechanic than might first appear. The idea is that the blocks accelerate very rapidly, and you have to, and when if you wait till gets to the top, you'll get a massive burst of speed. However, when you start getting to the more later levels, it will put you in scenarios where if you get the full boost of speed, Madeline will go flying into the spikes on the roof. So you have to time your jump off the block where there's a little bit of momentum instead of a lot of momentum. Or there's a level on the C side of the first one where instead of using the acceleration from the fast speed boost, you instead have to use the tiny bit of momentum you get from the block slowly sliding back into place. So there's very much, as you play through the game, it will always first present you the simple version of using the mechanic. But the further you get into the game, the more it will explore all aspects of the mechanic and expect you to master all aspects of the mechanic. And the depth and complexity of it just unfolds the more and more you play.
Yeah, it's an interesting balance because I don't think, like, I think with platformers, you can go a bunch of different ways to make a good platformer. Like, with level design, you know, we've played something like Super Mario World where it feels like every few steps they introduce a new concept and then immediately throw that concept away, or like they use it for like maybe half a level and then you never see it again. Like there's just hundreds of, you know, exciting things to find through the levels. And then there's games where they introduce like 3 mechanics and you'll spend like 3 hours with the one mechanic, with it slowly getting more and more interesting. And I think I like the middle ground that Celeste has landed on. Like each level has about, you know, usually 3 gimmicks, maybe 4. And, you know, the level will vary it up. So while, you know, a given level you'll mostly play with the same gimmicks, there is a bit of reprieve from each mechanic because it's like it's changing itself up enough but still exploring the mechanic enough to be interesting. And then like the next level you do, you won't see those 3 mechanics again. Most of the time you'll see 3 brand new ones, but then the levels, you know, it's like 20 minutes long, so they'll get a decent amount of mileage out of each one. And then once you beat the game, you get to start playing the levels again from the start, but the harder versions of that, and you go through it again, but there's like another level. So, you know, you come back to the first level, and then again, they, you know, start exploring these traffic light blocks, but to an even greater degree. And then, you know, you finish the game again a second time, and then you finish the game a third time. Yeah, it's really good. I never felt mechanic fatigue from seeing the same idea too much, but I was always impressed with how they managed to escalate the depth of these things, like from screen to screen. So to me, it's a really nice middle ground.
Yeah, like James said, it's pretty much bang on. Like they explore it well in the base game, and they continue to explore them further. If anything, I think that they could have gone even crazier with combining things, but I think the way that Celeste would rather create smaller, self-contained challenges is discouraging from putting, 30 things on one screen. Like they'd rather put 5 things on a screen and expect you to get those 5 things right than
Yeah.
just cram a bunch of things together.
Especially near the end where it feels like to beat some of the levels you need like close to perfect knowledge of the mechanic. Only having like 2 max on screen at once is kind of a good way of keeping it all in your brain as you're trying to beat the level, whereas I feel like, if they used 10 mechanics in one screen, it would be chaos. Like, it would be hard to keep track of all the little tiny details that you need to know to beat the level.
So, just returning to something you said earlier, which is that I would say it's interesting. When we're talking about Celeste, I think the temptation with 7A is to call it a precision platformer, right? We've said that the precision required is much, much higher than something like Mario, for example, in order to go through the levels. But the truth is, when you consider how quickly you respawn and how unpunishing the game is, I don't think it's fair to call so the first 7 chapters, the A sides, the main game, as a precision platformer. I think that making your way through Celeste, for the most part, is less about precision and more about conceptually understanding what it is you need to do on the level. And while technically the precision required is higher, I feel like the low punishment almost balances that out to a more reasonable level. When you're playing through the main game, you very rarely need to make like a precise jump between spikes. And when you do, it will be like, do these 2 precise jumps through spikes, and then you immediately get a new checkpoint. I remember there's one part in chapter 7 where you need to do some, a couple of precise jumps hitting crystals, and then it just gives you a checkpoint straight away. So I feel like one of the interesting things about this game is that it really is more about understanding and maximizing Madeline's moveset at first, as opposed to being super precise.
Yeah, I think the way the difficulty curve is structured, like from a high level point of view, is really good. Like, I think it's not a coincidence that the story ends at the end of the A sides. Like, I think that ending the story before the game, before shit really hits the fan difficulty wise, is a good thing. It lets basically anyone, experience the story. Obviously, some people struggle with the story. I definitely did my first try through, but if you persevere, it's definitely a manageable challenge. And then, all the really difficult content doesn't gate you out of the story.
It's also worth noting that the game comes with an assist mode that you can just toggle on at any time with no punishment of any kind or recognition of what you've done whatsoever. So if something is too hard for you, or you just can't be bothered dealing with it, you just be like, yep, I'm just gonna effectively skip this and go on to the next level, and you can just
yeah, it's very accessible to an understanding of the player. So there's just you can just skip rooms with it if they're too hard. Something that I really like about this game, and that lots of other games do extremely poorly, is this idea of catering to both your like casual audience and like your hardcore audience at the same time. Like, I think a lot of games do this terribly. Like, for example, when I played through one of the recent Mario games on Switch, I don't think it was Odyssey, or it might have been like the Wii U Super Mario. Something that bothered me was that I needed to play like 12 hours of the game before it became challenging for me. Like, it was like I had to put in this like 12 hours of work before I could get to the part of the gameplay that's fun. I think that they do this very gracefully by including lots of difficult optional challenges throughout the A sides in the form of the strawberry challenges.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, off the main path of the story, there'll be these extra rooms that have a strawberry that you need to collect by basically grabbing it and then landing firmly on the ground, or get to the start of the room. And these challenges will generally be much harder than...
Maybe slightly harder is probably a better way to put it.
I think some of them are pretty challenging. Like, even on my repeat playthrough, I found some of them hard, especially compared to the main game. But I guess to me, what this does is like if the story's not super challenging for you, there's always these like little, reprieves where you can actually get some engaging content before you get to the B-sides or whatever. And I think, having these for players who want to try a bit harder is good without, making the main game too difficult for the average player.
See, it's interesting. So I don't think the strawberries are much more challenging than the main game. I agree that they're a little bit more challenging, but I think that they're, for the most part, with one or two strawberries aside, they're only slightly more challenging than the main content of the game.
Hmm.
What I took from these strawberries, which I thought was very interesting, is that I think they are intrinsically enjoyable to complete. I think that a lot of games would feel compelled to give you some kind of meaningful upgrade or reward. It's like, here, we're doing a challenge. A lot of old games, these would be extra lives or whatever. But Celeste is such a joy to play, and it's so fun just to play the game, that the game can reward you with a meaningless strawberry. And I still got, literally 2/3 of the strawberries on my playthrough this time, despite playing the main game through twice before, just because the fun of platforming to get those strawberries was a reward in and of itself.
Yeah, like lots of collectibles in games will be, they'll be hidden in a little room or something, and there's stuff like that in Celeste. But I think the game having the confidence in itself that it is just fun to play and just giving you more of the game to play rather than some tacked on thing to get a collectible feels good. Like it feels really good. And I guess with that, I kind of want to talk a little bit about like specifics about the way Madeline controls that makes it feel good to play, because I think one of the most important things as a platformer, and I listened to some developer interviews, and they said this in one of their interviews, which I strongly believe, is that when developing the platformer, they had this feeling that we need to make it so if you were just in a completely blank room with nothing in it, and just had the character, like that it would be fun to play. Like it would be fun to use the character's moveset even when there's nothing. And I think that's mostly true here because Madeline feels incredible to control. Like, you turn on a dime, there's barely any, like when you walk, there's barely any acceleration time. You almost instantly go to full speed. When you let go of the stick, you slow down, you decelerate even faster. It's almost instant.
You have good air control.
You've got a good air control. Like when you're jumping through the air, letting go of the stick, you almost immediately start dropping straight down rather than maintaining this huge arc. But while you're jumping, how long you held the jump button, which direction you were pushing the stick. Like you have all of these little bits of control over the character's movement, which feels really good. And I play Celeste on the Switch specifically, and I think the feedback that you get from dashing, like there's the after images, there's the screen shake on console, there's the rumble, and the little sound effect is fantastic. Like I love the sound and the visual feedback of the dash.
Another one is that after you dash, you can kind of like reverse the momentum to a degree, or you can continue with the momentum. Like you even have control as your dash ends, what you're going to do after your dash.
Yeah, and again, that's like a big part of how they push the mechanics so far, is because there's all this like, this nuance to it that isn't apparent when you first start playing the game. And it just feels really good to control. It feels good to jump around. I feel like they spent hours and hours and hours like tweaking tiny numbers to get it into this spot. I never have a problem with how the game feels to control.
The design, I completely agree with you. I think that Madeline controls beautifully, and I enjoy controlling her pretty much more than any other platforming character. An interesting comparison is Hollow Knight, and Hollow Knight was designed far. I know it's not a pure platformer, but it does have platforming sections. It was modeled far more after Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which means that there is literally zero momentum, like it controls perfectly tightly. But in the end, having actual zero momentum and startup time to your run and stop time ends up feeling worse than having a little bit, like a tiny amount, like Madeline does.
Yeah, this game Celeste is the reason I can't finish Hollow Knight. Like I started Hollow Knight and I was like, this is a fun game. And then during that time I picked up Celeste, finished it, got to the end of the Seasides. And then when I picked up Hollow Knight, I was like, this feels like arse now in comparison. Like I hate the way it feels to control. Like I hate that his dash is always horizontal. It feels so janky and like bootleg. It doesn't feel as nice to control, and like it's in the back of my head the whole time I'm playing that game, to the point where I just don't want to play it anymore.
And like I quite like the controls of Hollow Knight, but as a platformer, Hollow Knight is clearly worse than Celeste. And I wish that the dash was at least cancelable in Hollow Knight. Like everything else is cancelable, but the dash is always a preset distance. But the point is that Celeste feels great because of that tiny amount of momentum, and it's nothing as bad. I was thinking about Another World and how when you stop running or try to start running, it takes several seconds.
Yeah.
And Celeste
Meat Boy's a bit like that too, and
yeah.
Sonic is even more extreme because of how long it takes to get to full speed. But that's kind of like the challenge of the game. And like there's obviously the way Meat Boy and Sonic do their momentum works well for their games, and it's there's no one best way to do this, but I think this is my favorite way to do this. Like, it just feels like I have close to perfect control of my character. Like, when we played Castlevania 1 the first time, and like you jump and you have zero air control until you land, it's just like a leap of faith. you know, that's like the polar opposite of this game.
See, it's not just the intrinsic control of Madeline either. It's how they've put a lot of care into trying to make it less about pixel precision and more about interpreting what it is you want to do. I think the most famous of these with Celeste is the fact that you can do what they call a roadrunner jump. If you run off the edge of a platform and press jump, you will jump in midair off that platform because they didn't want you to just run and slide off the platform because you were slightly off. If you are on an object that confers momentum, like those traffic light blocks that James was talking about, and you press the jump key a little bit late, you will still gain the momentum as if you had pressed it as it hit the apex. The game is very forgiving in trying to translate your intentions to what actually happens in the game. And while that can actually throw you off a little bit when you start getting into the advanced mechanics, by that point, there's an expectation that you understand the rules of momentum in the world and how it translates, so it's less painful than you might think.
Yeah, I really like stuff like how the bottom of the screen doesn't kill you for until you're quite deep into the bottom of the screen. It's very forgiving like that. Like if you press jump like a pixel before you hit the ground, it will make you jump when you land, so it doesn't feel like, your input got missed or something like that.
Yeah, instead of like buffering the input or whatever, it's, you hit jump, so you're going to jump now. Like it's a small thing, but it makes the world of difference when you're actually playing and controlling Madeline.
Yeah, and if you dash into like the top corner of a block, you'll kind of like wrap around the top and onto the platform, so you don't just bonk into it and then fall. I think this game, if it didn't have these dozens of little edge cases that they've specifically coded in to make the game feel more forgiving and better, would be extremely frustrating. And it's one of the reasons they can make the levels so difficult, is because they've gone out of their way to make it always feel like it's your fault when you die and never the fault of the game, which, I feel like, obviously in a lot of cases, like if you press jump a pixel before touching the ground, that is technically your fault, but in the heat of the moment, you don't feel that way. You think it's the game's fault, so they just deferred to the side of the player. And an interesting consequence of this for me is that the very hard levels expect you to know and abuse these things, because you can abuse these things if you're, playing correctly. And I guess this is something that is interesting and helpful to both, like, new players and players who are pushing the limits of the game. Like it's fun for both sides of the the spectrum.
The developers had a Mario ROM hack background, and you can absolutely tell that based on playing these games,
Yeah.
where there's an expectation that when you get to the late game stuff, that you really push the mechanics to
the absolute limits.
Well, I say to their limits, and then you watch a speedrunner and you realize that what you're doing is literally only a fraction of what the top players are doing. But it feels like you're pushing them to their limits.
Yeah, and that's a good thing, right? Like it feels good to overcome these sometimes like insane feeling challenges, like when you have to chain the advanced mechanics together. Because this game has like it's got like hidden mechanics that aren't it's like if you've played like Super Metroid or The Witness, spoilers, there's things you can do from the very beginning of the game that are like non-obvious. We can talk about that, but I think it's time for a music break.
Oh, but before we do, I just had one more concept about the basic mechanics. I just wanted to talk a little bit about Celeste and momentum, because we've touched on it a little bit, but I think this is something that I want to bring up because I think it's something that Celeste does literally better than any other platform I've ever played, and that's that Celeste has a fantastic sense of speed and momentum to all the things you're doing. You play, and I'm not saying like Sonic obviously is a game that kind of has momentum, although it often felt like the game was trolling me every time I wanted to go fast. I think Celeste delights in you going fast and accelerating in different directions. And I think that a lot of the levels are specifically designed so that when you successfully complete a level, it feels like one smooth flowing momentum thing from start to finish.
But I think it's not. I think it's very specifically not so fast that
you lose control, right?
I mean, it happens. Yeah. Like it's just fast enough that it's like exhilarating, not so fast that you always feel like you can't think while you're moving, I guess.
Well, like for example, very early on in level 2, you get introduced to the star blocks, which I think are one of the best ways to preserve your momentum. When you a star block is a big block that when you dash into, it will kind of like continue moving you through the block in that direction until you exit out the other side. And when you do exit out the other side, you exit with a bit of momentum and then you can dash again. So one of the things the game does is it puts several of these star blocks in a row so that you can dash from one to the other. And every time you emerge out the side of another star block, you have your dash back. So you can immediately dash again. So on a fairly large level, you can be dashing and jumping through these star blocks, and you basically can fly through the level in as little as 5 to 10 seconds, and you've done so extremely quickly.
Yeah, like the game knows how much more fun the dash is compared to a traditional double jump, which is somewhat, limiting. It's in a fixed arc often, maybe you have a bit of control over the angle, but there's just way more you can do with a straight line 8-way dash than you can with a double jump, and the game knows that. And basically, like, the majority of the obstacles, like the springs, the bumpers, the star blocks, like, will reset your dash so you get to use it very often in the game. And I really like that because you often get to a room and you look at it and you're like, all right, so I'll jump here, I'll spend my first dash like here so I can get this crystal, and then I'll spend my second dash like here. Yeah, and it's like a big puzzle of figuring out where to use your dashes.
Into this bubble, and when I come out of this bubble, I can dash again.
Yeah, and how to it's like figuring out where to use it, how to reset it, where to use the next one. It's like a looping kind of logic, which I like.
Well, what's really interesting is that I think the game starts off and there's a lot of safe areas for you to stand. Standing resets your dash, standing lets you sit there and do nothing. But the further you get into the game, the more the game laughs at you for wanting a safe spot to stand. And by the time you get to the really late game comment, there's more spikes than safe surfaces on the screen. But it doesn't feel unfair. It's just that once you learn to abuse the power of the dash, you just realize how much how much movement you can safely get out of your moveset when there are so many objects in the world that reset your dash and climb.
Yeah, it's really quite something. Yeah, I really enjoy the dash. It feels great. It looks great. And it has like infinite gameplay ramifications throughout the game. It's wonderful.
Anyway, James, you said music break. Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to
Yeah,
get
yeah.
that
Well,
away.
you can keep talking because this is your choice. So I imagine you have something to say about the soundtrack and the one you chose.
Yeah, so as I said earlier, I'm extremely high on the soundtrack. The song I'm going with is "Fear of the Unknown," which is the very first song that plays at the beginning of the Chapter 9 Farewell DLC. I like the vast majority of the music in this game, but there's something I think very touching about this piece. It's somehow both kind of like beautiful and melancholic while also being anxiety inducing, and it's a very interesting track that I think stands in contrast with the main game soundtrack. But I just found something quite beautiful and touching about the way the violins come in. I've only started listening to it recently, but I think this track, Fear of the Unknown, is excellent. I think it's the best on the DLC soundtrack, and it's my top 3 in the soundtrack overall. So here is Fear of the Unknown.
Well, that was Fear of the Unknown, and it's definitely the best song on the DLC soundtrack. I'm actually pretty low on the DLC soundtrack compared to the main game, actually, but I do like this one as well. I'm surprised you didn't go with the Mirror Temple theme, Patrick. You love that, and I love that. That would have been my second choice.
Yeah, I do like that one a lot as well. It's just, I guess I've spent more time playing Chapter 9 than I have the main game almost, so it's resonating more with me. But when I finished the game for the first time, I finished the main game, the B-sides, maybe 2 or 3 C-sides, I think 3 C-sides, and then I did the start of Chapter 9 when it was released and was like, man, this is way too hard for me, and stopped. This time round, I did everything except for the Golden Strawberry. So I did all of Chapter 9, all the B-sides, all the C-sides, and oh boy, was it tough. I think I clocked 7,500 deaths total over the entire game, and this is coming from someone who's beaten the main game twice and the B-sides once, so I wasn't exactly coming in completely fresh or anything. So, and yeah,
Yeah, it's hard, hey, and I love the B and the C sides. Like to me, after the story is most of the game. Even though maybe there's just as many rooms total, you spend so long on each room because it's so damn hard. So like we've kind of spoken about it briefly, but basically during the main story, each level contains like a cassette tape which you can find hidden in the level, which will unlock a more difficult version of the level, the B side, which again, second side of the cassette has its own music and remixed level, and the gap in difficulty between the story level and the B side is like gigantic. Like I'd almost say it's borderline a flaw with the game that the B sides don't ramp up in difficulty as gently as they should. But from then on, I think it's a gradual difficulty progression, which they do much more gracefully.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is one of the few missteps that Celeste actually makes. The difficulty curve throughout the main game is fantastic. The difficulty jump from A sides to B sides is just too high. And I think that unfortunately, a lot of people play the main game, see what the B sides are like, and then don't pursue it any further just because the difficulty gap is just too high in those areas. And I wish that there was, I think 1B and 2B are pretty reasonable, but everything after that really starts getting way
Yeah,
too hard. Like
yeah,
for example, there'll be a mechanic like on 4A there are snowballs that are flying towards you, right? And you're meant to dodge those snowballs. However, what you can do if you time it perfectly is you can jump on top of a snowball to reset your dash. The B side says, "Yep, you have to do that. If you want to beat this screen, you have to time jumping on top of the snowball to reset your dash, in addition to all this stuff earlier in the level." And I think that it just goes too far in terms of demanding precision from the player, when up until that point precision was always on the back seat and wasn't nearly as important to the Celeste experience.
yeah. Critically, I think it has to get to this point eventually. Like,
Yes.
there's no avoiding it becoming a precision platformer with the difficulty increase. It's just the curves a bit off. Maybe they could have, maybe the A, B, and C could have gently sloped up a bit more. Like 7B is really difficult. And also, I think the B sides are probably maybe a bit too long. They're almost like exhaustingly long. And because they're so difficult,
Yeah,
like,
there it takes you longer to do a B side than an A side. Like it might be, they might be, 2/3 in terms of length of an A side, but the increased difficulty means that it takes easily twice as long. Some of the B sides on this playthrough, the later ones, took me like 500 deaths to
yeah,
get past,
yeah,
whereas the entire main game was like somewhere between 800 and 1,000. So
yeah, it is very hard. Yeah, and then after the B sides, of course, most important part of the game, the C sides,
but
which is
but
even harder, right?
But it's far more reasonable because at this point you've done the B sides, and I don't think the C sides, in terms of what's demanded of you, ends up being enormously more difficult. The big
Yeah,
difference with the C sides, well, there's two big differences. The C sides are only 3 screens long each, and kind of 4 screens long on reflection because they give you a checkpoint. Thank God at one point, but they're very short, with the final screen of each being very long. Like, particularly 7C is like a minute and a half of platforming to get through. But the other thing that the seasides do is that the seasides start demanding you use some of the more technically advanced mechanics in the game. The big one of which is wall kicking off a dash, which is something that you're never required to do in the main game and has to be kind of taught to you how to do to get through. It's 7B.
I think they teach you how to do it 7B and the like near the end of the B side. Yeah, so what you can do is if you kind of like dash into a vertical wall and then immediately jump, it kind of reflects your momentum and retains it, so you'll get a lot of height.
And length, you kind of can curve off to the side after you do it as well.
Yeah, you get a lot of distance by doing this, and there'll be like a 4 pixel sized cube that you have to like with spikes on top and on the sides that you have to like perfectly dash into and kick off in order to complete these levels, and that's the only way to beat these levels. Like, that's how hard it gets later on. And then, even in chapter 9, it's like they start taking that for granted, and that's just a basic thing you do.
Yeah, well, chapter 9's mechanic is, of course, wave dashing, and this is once again advanced mechanic, as James said, that is just in the game that you can use from level 1 if you know about it. So, earlier on we said that when you do a dash, you need to either hit an item or land on the ground to reset your dash. What Celeste lets you do is that if you do a dash diagonally down into the ground and then jump as you are about to, shortly after you touch the ground, you will get a big speed boost from the dash where you land into the ground, but you will also reset your dash because technically you landed on the ground. So you get a big jump forwards, and you also have your dash to use again. And as you can imagine, getting a bunch of free distance on levels that are tightly designed around, you having exactly one dash at this point seems completely broken. And in fact, if you go back and play the game with knowledge of the wave dash, you can completely invalidate most of the challenges given to you.
It's great. There's so many rooms that you can just cheese with the advanced, like the wall jumps and like the hyper dash and the wave dash. There's all sorts of stuff like that you have. Technically you can do it right from the very first level, but you don't know these things exist.
Yeah, but the thing that's interesting is that chapter 9 doesn't just give you the wave dash and say, isn't this a cool thing you can do? The game demands that you master that wave dash. The game demands that you master the up wall kick. It's like, yes, this is now a mechanic that you're expected to know how to use, and the levels are going to be designed as if this was part of your arsenal. Good luck. Here's a level, and there's like a wall up in the distance facing away from you. That is your starting point for that level.
It's like this whole level is just you need to perfectly chain 3 wave dashes and a wall dash together. And that's the only way to beat the room. Like, that's right at the start of where they teach you how to do it. It's like, you just have to spend like 100 deaths on this room until you can do it.
So the question I have for you, James, is that now I think we're agreed that the jump from the A sides to the B sides is too much, and everything after that is kind of fair game. So when chapter 9 was released, they were thinking about releasing it as like a paid DLC, but when it turned out as difficult as it was, they ended up releasing it for free because they didn't want fans of the game to pay for the DLC and then let it be too hard. My question for you is, given it's introducing these more complicated mechanics, do you think that chapter 9 should have had a more gentle difficulty curve than what's presented here? Now, I'm not saying should it not be difficult at all. I'm more saying, do you think it could have escalated more gently into the kind of end game stuff it demands of you? Or do you think it's fine that it like almost immediately demands from you, all right, here's this super precise advanced technical thing. You have to do this to proceed in the level.
To be blunt, I really don't like how this level is just one level. It's not split up into A side, B side, C side, because I think it violates that idea that anyone can see the story. Like, I think, tying the final story progression to stuff that's like basically like D side level is kind of mean, I guess. I don't know. It just seems not right to me. I'd imagine that it's not that bad in practice, because really the only people who get to chapter 9 are the people who have beaten like chapter 8, which is like an unlockable level that you have to do heaps of the hard challenges to even get to. So
you have to complete you have to get 15 hearts unless you use like this intentional exploit to skip the heart gate. So there is an expectation that you at least beat the B sides.
Yeah, so I like anybody who's getting through the heart gate on chapter 9 like has probably gone through all the C sides, right? Like,
I would recommend it. It's like the way I would describe chapter 9 is that I don't actually think it's necessarily harder, except in a couple of instances. But mostly, yeah, I wouldn't say it's strictly harder than the B or C sides. It's more like it's all of the B and C sides put together in one level. Like it's just a continuous stream of B and C sides. And, for the most part, it's I like, for example, I think that 7C specifically is probably still the hardest level in the game, but it's definitely up there.
I'd imagine there's bits in Chapter 9 that are harder than that level.
Maybe 7C is just so long and requires precision from start to finish.
Yeah, I feel like if I did it again now, like it would take me 100 deaths still, but not 300 deaths.
Now,
You know what
this
I
is
mean?
my first time doing it, I guess, which is why I found
Yeah.
it so hard.
Oh yeah, it took me like a week to beat that one room, like the first time I did it. But like Chapter 9, like I feel like I'm much more precise and intentional with like the directions I put on the analog stick now. And I think that you have to be when you start wave dashing and wall jumping at the same time.
Mhm.
I think a lot of the rooms kind of demand that kind of precision and for you to master it. Yeah, it's interesting. It's probably not a problem overall, just because you know the people who are playing this level probably are already down for that kind of challenge anyway, right?
Yeah, I have to say I do mostly agree with you, and I know that that's just coming from my perspective as a person who enjoys this kind of challenge. But I have to say, one of the things I really like about Chapter 9 is that the game continues to challenge you and demands that you improve your skills. The game is never just a cakewalk that you do with your eyes closed. The game is always a struggle, always a challenge. And I like that about video games. I like when games demand my attention and it makes things much more interesting. Like, some people will play a game like Red Dead Redemption 2. And Red Dead Redemption 2 is this big 60-hour long game with this involved narrative and everything. But from what I've seen of it, it's not a mechanically demanding game. It's more about the experience. I far prefer what a game like Celeste does. My final playtime for the entire game clocked in at 30 hours, which is like half of what Red Dead Redemption 2 requires. But all of those 30 hours was filled with engaging, difficult gameplay that I had to struggle to overcome. And in the end, I just prefer that kind of experience from video games than one that is just a gentler, easier experience mechanically that never evolves in favor of story.
Yeah, me too. Like I'd say if you're not down for bashing your head against a wall like repeatedly to beat like lots of levels, because that's the core experience of this, then you might not enjoy this game.
Yeah, so the A sides are for everyone. I think vast majority of people will get a lot of enjoyment out of the A sides, whether they're experienced with platformers or not. But in a lot of ways, that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Celeste. Like, I would say the time, like I spend at least 80% of my time with the post game content.
Yeah.
So it just depends what you're after. If you're kind of not really into this kind of experience, you can buy Celeste as a 6 to 8 hour game for your first playthrough and have a really good time. But if you can also buy Celeste as a 40-hour or 50-hour experience if you are more engaged with the more, I guess, hardcore or difficult or challenging parts.
Yeah,
of the
it's
game.
interesting. When I remember when I first played this game, because everyone was talking about how great it was, and I got to the end of the story and was like, yeah, that was enjoyable. It wasn't like, this 10 out of 10 game that everyone else is saying it is. And then, it was during the B and the C sides where I really fell in love with the gameplay, I think. Like, I think if you just play the story, or at least, for me, if I had just played the story, I wouldn't be anywhere near as high on this game as I am having gone through all the challenging content. And I'd also say that, like, Celeste isn't like a super flashy revolutionary game. It's taken what has worked in the past and just refined the hell out of it. Like, when I was playing the game, I never got this sense that this is something incredibly revolutionary or like some exciting mechanic. It was just like, a good mechanic after good mechanic. And only after going back and playing other platformers did I realize just how good it was. Like, I think the first time I played the game, I took the idea of there being so many checkpoints for granted. And then when I went to play like Super Mario World or something like that, I realized just how much better that shit is than how, every other game did it. And then it made other games feel bad in comparison rather than, my initial experience with the game being this like mind-shatteringly good thing.
To me, it takes what's present in Super Mario ROM hacks and refines it to a far better
Yeah.
product. Like this is what, if Super Mario ROM hacks were a full proper game, this is what they would be, and it's brilliant. And I've only played like one Mario ROM hack, but I've played a fair bit of Mario Maker. But yeah, you can just see the DNA from start to finish in its design principles and its frequent checkpoints and everything.
Yeah. Like on the whole, I would mostly recommend this game for people who like challenging themselves and, repeatedly trying and failing over and over. Like if that's not the kind of game that sound appealing to you, I probably wouldn't recommend, even just the story. Just because I think, most of the engagement comes from that really challenging stuff later on. So with that, I think it's time for another music break that we added during editing after realizing that we went a bit too long without giving you guys another one. So here's a good chance to listen to the Mirror Temple B-side. It's definitely my second favorite track on the whole soundtrack, and I think it's Patrick's number one. So this is Mirror Temple B-side. I do want to talk a bit briefly, going back to Chapter 9, about some criticisms I have about certain parts of the gameplay in general. Because I don't want to, because I love this game, but I don't want to like only praise it. So something I think the game does really well is that often the challenging content is very obvious about what you need to do. Like sometimes you need to try a little bit, but once you've died like 4 times, you kind of understand what path you need to take, and then it's like a matter of tightening up your gameplay. And lots of the mechanics are very like the bumper, for example. If I land on the top of the bumper, I always go straight up. On the side, I always go straight to the side. It's almost like digital. Like there's only like 8 possible scenarios, probably more, but it's not like a purely analog circle where every single point on the bumper sends me in a different direction, and I think that's good. I felt like the 2 mechanics they introduced in Chapter 9, the jellyfish and the pufferfish, were a lot more fiddly in that regard. Like, obviously, the pufferfish, the top and the bottom are distinct, but I felt like there was so much like give and so much opportunity to fuck it up that it was a lot more frustrating than I found most, like any of the other challenges in Chapter 9 were the ones that featured those 2 mechanics. I felt like there was less time in the oven with those two to really, that thing where they translate the player's intent rather than what's happening on the screen feels like it didn't have that level of polish, because I felt like I died a lot and I felt like it wasn't entirely my fault at times, even though it probably was. But I got that feeling a lot more with those mechanics than I did anywhere else. And it kind of soured the mechanics for me a bit.
That's kind of interesting because I love the jellyfish. The jellyfish is like a parachute that you can dash into to kind of extend the length and height of your movement, and you'll float up into the air and float slowly to the ground when you've got it. A lot of the puzzles and platforming challenges require you to be throwing this jellyfish around off springs and picking it up again at critical moments, and I really liked it. Like I'd say that the bits where you're carrying around Theo are some of my favorite parts of the game, particularly the B and C side and tapes.
The Theo bits are a good example because he's a big crystal that you grab and you carry around. It feels like with Theo, if you're in his general area and you press grab, you'll pick him up, whereas I felt like oftentimes my character model was touching the jellyfish and I pressed grab and it didn't grab it. Like, you had to be very precisely near the center of it to grab it.
So I actually looked this up. That's not actually what it is, but there is something funky about the jellyfish. So the regrab time for Theo after you throw him is 1/10 of a second. The regrab time for the jellyfish is like 3/10 of a second. So
right, yeah, that explains it.
If you immediately try to grab it, like the moment you let go of it, you'll just go straight through it.
Yeah, that happened to me a lot.
Yeah, I don't know why they made this change, because I agree with you. The lower grab time on Theo makes it feel a lot better. Yeah. But the jellyfish is actually quite generous in terms of its grab hitbox. It's just that you need to be aware that there's like the re-grab time is delayed. And once you realize that, you can play around it. But
I guess specifically with the jellyfish, the levels that annoyed me were ones where you needed to throw it at a wall and grab it again quite quickly. What you just said is definitely why I died like 100 times in that room, because I didn't understand that and it's not clear to the player. That's a problem, right?
Yeah. Yes, 100% it is. But to be fair, once you understand it, it's actually fine from a mechanical point of view. But the fact that it doesn't explain it to you, the fact that it's just reasonable to assume it would function the same as Theo, and so you treat it as such, is a problem. It should communicate that clearer to the player. Yeah, but once you know it, I will say that it all of a sudden becomes much easier to grok and flow through the level. Yeah, so I'm glad I found that online before I was finished. As for the pufferfish, the problem I had with the pufferfish at first is that I didn't realize that holding down jump while you were ricocheting off them increased the amount of acceleration you got from the fish.
Yep.
Once again, it's almost like a semi-hidden mechanic that it doesn't communicate clearly to the player.
I mean, the springs, like all of the other...
the springs don't, but the bumpers.
No, the springs
do.
definitely do. Absolutely do. Like, I ran into this problem where I couldn't beat levels in Chapter 9, and then I figured out that holding jump on a spring made you go.
I just figured that right, I was thinking of sideways springs, which I don't think make you go further, but you just can continue your initial momentum from the spring if you hold down jump.
I'm unsure of that specific, but yeah,
but
vertically definitely.
But I found that the jellyfish ended up being fairly similar to the bumpers eventually. I didn't love the jellyfish or anything, but it's interesting that you have such problems with them, because I think one of the things that becomes clear, particularly as you move through the seasides, is the degree of variability in these objects that you initially assume don't have it. Like, the other one that comes to mind is the on the core side, you have these, when you're on the lava side, you have these crumbling blocks, and when you kind of land on them or push against them, they will ricochet. They'll kind of like buckle a little bit, then ricochet you in the opposite direction. And depending on where you land on the block will give you a different kind of arc of movement.
I also find those things to be a bit fiddly, to be honest.
Okay,
Now that you mention it, yeah.
So for me, I actually quite like this as a high end mechanical thing, and I think it's a very natural progression. When you first start playing Celeste, you don't really distinguish between where you're interacting with these objects, and the level design doesn't demand that you understand it. But the further you get in, the more precise you have to be with your understanding of these environmental objects. And to me, the pufferfish were just another one of those environmental objects that I had to be precise with.
I guess when it gets up to that degree of fiddliness is when I start falling off, like being as high. Like, I guess I really like even just like dashing through a maze of spikes, I enjoy that because, you know, you have 8 ways to dash, so it's not like you can press the analog stick a little bit off and it'll still go the way you're intending it to. Like, there's like a bit of give, again, translating what the player wants to do. Yeah, I guess there was just a lot of trial and error with those blocks and the jellyfish of where you need to touch it to, and it became very touchy. I guess it's maybe I'm just bad.
I'm not denying the reality of your experience. I'm just saying I had a different experience with them. And I think Chapter 9 does do that of you. Like there's levels with star blocks where if you don't enter the star block at the correct height, you will die. Like you need to enter the star block at the upper quarter or the lowest quarter, or when you come out the other end, you're going to crash into spikes. And I think that Celeste does this consistently with all of its higher end mechanics. The main game doesn't demand precision of you, but when you get to the late game, it does, and it does it in every way, not only in precise dashing, but in precise interaction with objects.
Yeah, I guess in the main game, once I felt like I understood what to do and I'd practiced a few times, like once I solved the room, I feel like if I did the room again immediately, I'd do it. Whereas I feel like once it gets harder, there's like this probability thing where I can't consistently land on the breaking block at the same spot every time. So it's like 1 in 3 attempts I'll get to try to beat the level, and it's kind of just rolling the dice, hoping that I connect on the right point. But, you know, that's a problem with me, I guess.
I mean, I would like to highlight a moment where the precision required in this game did piss me off. And I think there are a couple of times where the precision demanded is probably just a little bit too high. The first one is in the room 5C. 5C requires you to do a
that level.
Wall kick off a diagonally down moving red bubble, which is kind of like a bubble that just spits you a long distance that you can dash out of any time. But when it's going diagonally down and you have to execute an up wall kick, the timing required to nail that is very precise. Like it is not a generous timing in the slightest. And that one jump is responsible for, I'd say, 400 of my 500 deaths on that level. I just would fail it over and over again, and it made that screen frustrating because I felt like I was just getting choke pointed on one specific jump over and over again.
Yeah, I've seen people complain about that room before. It was the thing I hated the most the first time I played the game. I actually, when we played through it all again, I specifically skipped that one just because it makes me so mad. Like 7C is extremely hard, but
no one part of it is that hard. It's more evenly spread out.
But when I fail at that level, I'm not frustrated. I just try again, and I'm happy to play that game that level 100 goes in a row, failing every time because it's just a well-designed level that feels fair the entire way through. And I guess one thing I like about Celeste is, you know, when you die, you don't need to do a lot of tedious busy work to get up to the bit you're struggling on, and in 5C it felt like I had to just do the easy part of the level again and again before I got to that one bit.
And in addition to precision, the other thing I wanted to talk to you about, James, was cycles. And I know this is something that we've already disagreed about before, but I wanted to air it out a bit more and dive into why we disagree on it. So a cycle or a cycle level is when there are objects in the game world that are on a timer almost. Like most obviously on level 3, there are these things called dust bunnies that will kill you if you collide with them, and they are just zipping up and down the screen. So they go up and then they'll go down. So you have to time a jump in between those dust bunnies or when it's at the lower or higher part to not die. As you get to the more complicated versions of these levels, which require quite precise timing to get through them. Generally, the stuff on the core, which has bouncy platforms and fireballs, and the more complicated Dust Bunny levels, I found myself not enjoying the game as much because instead of executing a jump in my own time and trying to beat these challenges, I guess, on my own schedule, I was instead memorizing locations to be depending on what the cycle dictated. So once you've died 16 times, I know that if I immediately hold down right and hit the spring, I can dash at exactly this point to get through the gap between these things. Not because I'm reading the screen and dashing between them, but because I know I've memorized this timer. So, James, to me, these levels are worse, but I think you said you feel differently about it.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that since you brought it up earlier. I'd also, I guess, say that I'm lower on those levels than the average level. Like, I got to one recently where it's like, if I just, like, immediately as soon as the room starts, because the room starts in the same spot every single time, which is great. I just jump 3 times and then wave dash off the third jump because that's the perfect timing for these like blocks to be in the right spot that I won't hit them when I hit a spring. And I've just memorized that I have to do that at the start of every single attempt is jump 3 times and then wave dash in order to be in line with the clock of the level. And I kind of agree because like one of the things you want to do early is like you stand in the room and you figure out what you need to do. And then sometimes it's like I figure out what I need to do, and then it's just a matter of figuring out the exact timing of when I need to start doing my sequence of jumps.
Yeah.
And it's not really that interesting. It's just
and when you
boring.
get to the eighth movement that you need to make or whatever, you'll dash and you'll die and you'll be like, all right, well, I need to hang for half a second more in the air before doing that dash. It's not because you've read the screen. You're just like memorizing a script, which I think is less interesting than, I guess, just the fundamental enjoyment of executing the level on your own terms.
Yeah, to me, that's kind of the same sort of preciseness that I dislike about the jellyfish and the pufferfish, for example. It's like, yeah, it's just about like memorizing something. The puzzle of the room is de-emphasized, and it's more about like just doing it a million times until you have that rhythm, I guess. I mean, I don't hate them that much more than regular levels, but I do admit that the ones I like less tend to be those ones. It's just, I guess, testing a different skill that I'm less interested in.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I hate them. Like I still enjoy the game. It's just those are always my least favorite screens.
What would you say is like your favorite levels?
I think this is a good segue because I think overall my favorite level, despite dying hundreds of times, is probably 7C. And the reason I like 7C is that it's difficult and engaging from start to finish. Like the very first jump in the level is difficult. The things you have to do in the middle of the level are difficult. Things you have to do at the end of the level are difficult. It's a long screen, so it requires you a level of endurance and memory to get through it. But critically, it's not a backloaded level of difficulty where the first minute of the screen is boring and easy and then it's really hard at the end, and it's not front loaded in terms of difficulty. It's just difficult and engaging the whole way through. So when you finally beat it, it's very satisfying, and I think the entire time you're learning to beat it and trying to beat it, it's satisfying because you cannot let up. You have to be on point for every single one of the tricks you have to do from start to finish.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, actually. I think 7C is also probably my favorite level. I'd also give special mention to 1 and 2C. I think they're both great levels. I think
Hmm.
1B's quite good. For the the A sides, it's hard. It's
Level
probably
7. Come on.
it's okay. I don't love it. It's funny because I really like the first level's stuff, but the first level in the A side is just too easy for me to love it. I do love that you can beat it without dashing, which we've tried for a long time and failed at
Too hard.
miserably. Too hard, yeah. I quite like Reflection,
Mm.
and
The boss battle's just a lot of fun, right?
yeah, it is. I'd say least favorite levels. Actually, on replaying it this time, I ended up realizing I don't quite like level 4 as much as I thought I did. It's just quite long.
Also, the wind's annoying. Like when the wind's blowing against you, when the wind's blowing with you, it's fun. But when the wind's blowing against you,
I
it's
don't
just
mind I don't mind it against you. It's okay. I think we both agree that the resort level's probably the worst one.
hmm. It's very long, and like I said, thematically, it feels like a drop off. It's like we're just going through a hotel.
I like the music. I still wouldn't put it as like a bad level. Like I still enjoy
There are
it.
no awful levels in this game. Like I mean I know you hate 5C, but I think that the average quality of the levels is extremely high.
Mm, yeah, I'd say there's a few select levels that I love. But I just enjoy the basic gameplay so much anyway that
Oh, I told a lie. So what I wanted to segue into is I think there is one actively bad level in this game and one actively bad screen that I despise. And that is
okay.
the very final screen of chapter 9. So
Really?
the final screen of chapter 9 is the longest level in the game. It probably takes 1.5 to 2 minutes to go through. And you would think, this is the culmination of the final challenge. It's okay that this is extremely challenging and long, and I do agree with that. The problem with the level is not that it's long. The problem with the level is that it's boring. So I would say, in terms of mechanical skill demanded, Chapter 9's final farewell screen is equal to an easy B-side or the end of a difficult part of chapter 8. The thing that makes it hard is that it takes forever to get through, and every time you get to a new section and you fail it, you have to repeat this long boring section. And I think that everything in this final screen goes against the design philosophy of Celeste, which is we're going to give you a high challenge, but it's going to be a forgiving challenge where you just can instantly get back into it. This level demands you do this boring ass start of the level, which takes a minute every time you want to get to the part of the level that's interesting. And I was getting so annoyed at this level, not because it was hard, but because it was tedious. And I think it's a real it's really disappointing that the final level is like this, because this should be the culmination of everything you've done. There should be wave dashing and wall kicking, but there's none of that. It's all quite simple.
It's weird when the last stretch of the summit's A side solves this problem with having just
100 checkpoints.
100 checkpoints and just one really long screen. That's to me, they did it right there, and I haven't gotten up to it yet, but I imagine I'll feel the same as you.
Well, I really liked the wave dashing. I had to learn how to do it, but the feeling you get, the fact that Madeline can now, the game is so much about momentum, and once you've learned wall dashing and wave dashing and wall kicking, you realize that Madeline's capable of generating an enormous amount of momentum without any environmental or world objects at all. You can just be flying around the place at max speeds with nothing to help you. And I think that the realization that you can do that kind of unlocks a deeper part of the game. But this was not like this. This was very slowly holding a jellyfish as it slowly floats, and you avoid obstacles. It's not good. I'm really surprised they decided to go this way with this level.
Yeah, it's hard for me to comment having not got there myself yet. I reckon I'm on the back half of chapter 9 now.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that doesn't sound good. That sounds like the opposite of what the game's. Yeah, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's supposed to be a bit of reprieve, but honestly, I'd expect it to be ball-bustingly hard.
There is a hidden secret ending that you can access, which does have some more mechanically demanding things. But the problem is you still have to go through that entire first thing to
Yeah.
even access that. And then you have to and then if you fail the hard bit, you're all the way back to the start. So I just am not a fan of it. When the rest of the quality is so high, this felt like a dramatic drop off. And it's really my biggest complaint about the game overall, I gotta say.
Hmm. Okay, well, we already said we liked the game. This is usually the part of the review where we say whether we recommend it. And obviously, we both love this game, and I would recommend this game to lots of people, but specifically to like people who like bashing their head against the wall and failing a million times. This game is brilliant for those people. I'd say if you love platformers, this is an easy recommend. Regardless of your skill level, I think that a big theme of Celeste is being able to overcome adversity. It being more about you overcoming your self doubt than overcoming the actual challenge. Like I was, browsing online and I saw that it took some people like literally like 16,000 deaths to beat Chapter 9, which is like a long ass time, but they did it because they persevered, and I think that's a big theme of the game. So if you're kind of in for that kind of challenge, then I think there isn't really too many games better for that experience.
I think Celeste is the best 2D platformer ever made. And I know that, a lot of people will cry heresy at that, but this to me is the perfect platformer in a lot of ways. Madeline's tremendous fun to control. She's even more fun to control once you figure out how much momentum she can generate. The levels are tightly designed. The levels encourage you to experiment, and they're challenging but not punishing. The difficulty continues to ramp up throughout the entire experience, so you're always engaged and interested. It's fun to play to the point where the platforming is a reward in and of itself. And it's even got a good story, which is remarkable. How many 2D platformers have good stories? But this game even has a good story. I highly recommend Celeste to everyone. Even if you're not into platformers, I still think the main game you can get a lot of value from. And as James said, if you're the kind of person who enjoys the challenge of video games, Celeste is marvelous. It just keeps getting deeper and deeper and deeper and continues to challenge you. Fantastic game from start to finish. One or two quibbles aside, there's really not much wrong here. It's a 10 out of 10 game, and I hope that platformers in the future learn from Celeste, and I know that some already have. So well done to the developers of Celeste. This is, when I think of like good platformers, this is the standard by which I'm comparing them to.
Yeah, I kind of agree. Like, this is my favorite 2D platformer too. I haven't played like a ton of them, but we've played a bunch for the show and I've played others outside. Easily my favorite. Like, I think just the fundamental way it lets you retry over and over, it just makes it so much more enjoyable. And it's so easy to like pick up and play. Like when I played it on Switch, and something really good is that because all the levels, like all those screens, are self-contained, it's like I can put this game down for a week and come back to it mid-level by resuming my Switch and not need to know anything about the level in order to continue playing it. Like I just look at the screen and that's my challenge, and I just have it next to my computer. If I'm sitting in Discord with friends or queuing for Dota or something, I can just pick it up and do a level whenever I want. If we were out at Magic or something, between rounds, I could pick it out of my bag, play a level. It's just the structure is perfect, basically. Like I think this is the gold standard for how to structure your platformers. And obviously, not the only way to do it, but it is by far my favorite way.
Yeah, so I think that's about it. Thank you so much, everyone, to listening to us talk about Celeste. I hope you've enjoyed our experiment with a bit more of a modern game. If you've enjoyed it, please let us know. James and I have always talked about doing modern games every now and then as part of our regular programming. If you want to hear more of it, we'd love to hear. If you want to hear more of this, we'd love to hear what you have to say. If you hated it, we'd also love to hear what you have to say. So James and I make up the Retrospectives podcast. We review these classic games, and in this case, a modern classic. You can find all of our content on our website, which is rspodcast.net. It's got all of our episodes as well as a bunch of articles that James and I have written. Most importantly, we'd love if you drop by and join our Discord community. This is where most of our community engagement happens. So we have lots of discussions about old games and new ones, and we take suggestions as well. So if you'd like to join the conversation, we heavily encourage you to join our Discord server. So James, this is the end of the experiment. It's time to go back to our regular programming. And because you picked the last game before the break, which was
Street Fighter 2,
I now get to pick a game. And you know what, James? I think it's been too long since we've done a stealth game. It's been at least 6 months. We got to get back into stealth gaming. We've only played half the stealth games in existence. We need to get into the other half. So I have chosen to do Splinter Cell Chaos Theory. So we did Splinter Cell 1 earlier. We both really enjoyed it. I think that Splinter Cell is fascinating in that it's a console stealth game that took a lot of cues from Thief in terms of its moment-to-moment gameplay, but kind of wrapped them up in a more linear level design space. And I think it produced an experience that was, in my mind, not as good as Thief, but still very commendable and still very tightly designed. I liked it a lot. And I know that Chaos Theory, which is the third in the theories, is largely regarded as the high point of the entire series, in terms of it rounding out and refining this linear third-person stealth experience. We skip Pandora Tomorrow because it's mostly more of the same, but everyone loves Chaos Theory, so it seemed natural to go to the high points to see what it really had to offer. Have you heard of Chaos Theory before, James?
Yeah, it's the one people always talk about. I'm okay with doing this game because I liked Splinter Cell 1 more than I did Thief, by quite a bit, so I'm excited to see where the series goes next. I'm hoping that the story is maybe a bit more interesting this time around, and I really hope that they keep, this idea of changing your walking speed with the mouse wheel. I thought that was great the first time around.
I can confirm it does, and not only that, it now has 5 variable move speeds instead of 3. So
ooh, that's exciting.
Including crouching versions of that. So it's
does
even better.
Does it have the Metal Gear Solid 4 tiptoe crawl with the fingertips where you move
they're super slow.
Yeah.
I don't like, you can move pretty slow in this game, but it's not. I
feel like that crawl speed's like a meme more than anything, right?
Yeah, so Metal Gear Solid has far more than 5 degrees of movement. The analog stick, I don't know how many it is in the later games, but it must be like up to 15 different speeds depending on how much you're moving on the analog stick. Splinter Cell still feels pretty analog. Like, I'm playing on mouse and keyboard, you use the mouse wheel, but 5 is pretty good. It's definitely better than Thief's 2 or 3 effective move speeds. So I'm a big fan of how it's implemented in Splinter Cell.
Well, hopefully it lives up to the first game. I imagine it will, since so many people think it's the best in the series. And, probably just going to be a good game. So looking forward to talk about how it changes things up.
Yeah, so we'll see you all in a fortnight for Splinter Cell Chaos Theory. Adios, everyone.
See you then.